Welcome to Grid Talk. My name is Ruby Price, and today we're here to assign our 2025 Formula One season driver grades. A big thank you to Green Wheels India for sponsoring this episode of Grid Talk. Head to greenwheels.in to check them out. And joining me today, we have the griller of Grid Talks himself, Mr. Louis Edwards. How are you doing, Louis?
I'm very good, thank you.
Good to have you on. As always, we'll be using the standard F to A plus grading system. If you get an F, you are failing, up to a C for being average, and then you've got your A and your A plus for being exemplary. We all assign our own grades individually and then take the average and voila, you've got a Grid Talk grade. So if you disagree with these, let us know what your grades were in the comments below and feel free to shout at us on social media because that's not what Formula One fans have been doing all season. But yeah, let's skip the preamble. Let's get down to part one of our driver grades episode. And we're going to start off with the Fs. There's only one F. It's Franco Colapinto. Louis, I gave him an F. You gave him an F. Mid-season, we gave him an F. Is this the most consistent we're ever going to see Franco Colapinto?
Well, he was consistently not getting any points, was it? It wasn't. His season has been noteworthy in the sense that there was nothing of note. Like he has just fumbled his way through the season. We're looking at his best performances all came in that opening half of the season when he was still, people were like still giving him the benefit of the doubt. But we have kind of got through the second half of the season, we've seen very little in terms of improvement, and he has done nothing of note. He has not been particularly great all season. Gasly and Alpine in general have had a difficult second half, but Franco hasn't exactly stepped up to the mark at all to try and improve his racing. And at the end of the day, he's got 0 points, and it's disappointing. It's disappointing. It's there was a lot of talk around Franco coming into Alpine at the start of the season after Jack Doohan had been dropped after only 5 races. There was a lot of expectation that Franco could maybe do a good job, and ultimately he hasn't. And the fact he's still signed on for next year just shows how much Alpine need the money.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. Like, they signed him in the off season for 20 million to have as a reserve driver just sitting on the benches. And it's like, you don't spend that amount of money to have someone sat on the sidelines for a start. But when Doom just, like didn't quite really set the world alight in the opening couple of rounds, like I think there was always that expectation of so when are Alpine going to announce it? When are Alpine going to announce it? Lo and behold, they announced it, and then there was this expectation of, oh, Franco's only going to get 5 races. So then once those 5 races finished, and he hadn't done any better at that point than Jack Doohan had really done, it was like, okay, so when are you going to drop Franco now? So there was always that external pressure like coming on for Franco, but was it a case of like that pressure's what's led to it, or was it just that Alpine just never really delivered for him?
I think it's a little bit that out on Alpine because let's face it, Alpine haven't delivered for either of any of their drivers, not just either. All three of the drivers that they've had in that car this season, they've failed to deliver for. Pierre Gasly has unfortunately got the brunt of that as the most experienced driver in the team now, and he has just been given a god awful car. And we'll get onto his grade and performances later. But Alpine this year have been a mess. It's obvious that they have been looking ahead to 2026 with the rule changes and hoping to build a good car for that. But if Pierre Gasly was able to scramble some points, you would have thought that the opportunity would have come along at some point for Franco to get that, and it looked like that at the towards the mid break when he had that 11th place in the Dutch Grand Prix, but has completely failed to even nearly score points. Something that we can respect. It's like, well, he had the opportunity was there. It just this happened or that happened. This has been the case of there's never been an opportunity. He's never even looked like he's going to score points.
Yeah, like there was that one time he qualified in the top 10 in Canada ahead of Pierre Gasly, but it just never really showed up for Franco. And with that, we'll move on to the E's. And, whilst I don't think there's too much really for us to add to this, given we already discussed Jack Doohan at the mid-season driver grades, which you can obviously go and check out if you're interested. But we've given him an E because obviously nothing else could change in the second half of the season. But we were just talking about this before we started. Do we look more fondly at Jack Doohan's brief stint in the Alpine, like out of sympathy for him being dropped? Because there's obviously been very recently an outing for Mr. Doohan in Super Formula and three crashes at the same corner as well. Was he ever fit for Formula One? And does he deserve this E grade we've given him?
Well, it's technically his fourth crash at Suzuka, given he had quite a walloping. Was it qualify or on the free practice sessions when he was in Formula One too? So Suzuka is not a particularly great circuit, it would seem, for Jack Doohan. But yeah, I think at Lefty when we were doing our mid-season, there was this comparison between him and Franco that I think that we were all doing. It was how well was his first five races in comparative to how Franco was doing. And Franco didn't have the worst starts, but I think it wasn't as bad as Doohan's, but I think a lot of us did was playing that kind of sympathy card of, oh, we kind of feel bad for Doohan. We didn't particularly want, maybe a lot of us feel like we didn't want Colapinto to come in so quick, and we were all expecting him to leave after five races. And when he didn't, it kind of aggravated us a little further. It's just like, oh, God's sake, just waiting for like Paul Aaron or something to take that seat back, but that never happened. But any for Jack Doohan, I think it's possibly a little kind.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And, as I say, a lot of sympathy there. Rookies deserve their shot, but at the same time, sometimes you're just not fit for Formula One. And that appears to have been the case for Jack Doohan, as sad as it is to say. So we'll move on to Yuki Tsunoda, other E grade driver. I gave him an E. Louis, you gave him a D, and at mid-season as well, we did give Yuki a D. From having a look at his results, it appears he generally had stronger performances in the sprints, which probably suggests not as quick over the entire race. And, I think the statistics as well that we've got, 33 points. He's 390 behind Lando Norris at the end, but I guess that means 388 doing some quick mental maths behind Max Verstappen. It's a tale of two drivers in two completely different stages of their career, really. And now we know he's not going to be on the grid for next season. This is Yuki's final representation of himself, really, unless he comes back for Honda later on, really. Do you think it was a good season for him?
No.
Yeah, exactly.
In all honesty, like he had a couple of good, like all right showings in racing, like in that Racing Bull car in the first couple of races. He then did get very quickly thrown into the deep end in Red Bull and did start getting, a few points finishes, which was like, okay, it was better than what Lawson was doing. Lawson was qualifying at the back, finishing at the back. It was a bit miserable, and Yuki comes in, getting the odd points here and there, as you mentioned, like getting points in the sprint. But it kind of that where we kind of cut off for mid-season, like Yuki had a good enough start that I feel like we were giving him a little bit of a benefit. And honestly, his performances after the summer break were very lackluster and very like uninspiring. But towards the latter end of the season is where we've seen him get these better points finishes. But I still, yeah, it's I think an E, I think maybe a D. I was being a little kind, considering we probably slaughtered Sergio Perez in the driver grades last year, and he scored over 100 points more than Yuki did this season. And that was the year where we were talking, oh my God, look at the gulf. Max has got like 400 something points and Checo's like on 100. How could you possibly have such a gap between teammates? And if we look at the drivers' championship this year with Max, in the end finishing second, not winning the championship this year, but still having 421 points, which is almost 400 points more than Yuki scored throughout the season. Yeah, it's really not a good showing. And I know the Red Bull hasn't been great, and Max really did push everything he could. But when that Red Bull was good and Max really started his title charge, we should have started seeing the same kind of trajectory from Yuki, but we didn't.
Yeah, there was a lot of instances where Yuki would have a really poor qualifying, and whilst Checo might be able to at least get up to like mid points, like sixth, seventh, eighth, a lot of the time we saw Yuki just staying in that 15th, 16th, even 17th like stage of the season. And it's like you're in a Red Bull, regardless of how like, I think it was I can't remember which driver it was that I think it was Alex Albon that described it as like increasing the sensitivity on like your controller or your mouse or things like that. But like even with that analogy, you're a Formula One driver. You should at least be able to get it into the points reliably from that. And granted, Yuki Tsunoda did have some decent turnarounds, most notably probably like Kota going 13th to 7th. But that's not going from, Nico Hulkenberg, as we'll get to, started 17th and finished third in Silverstone. Like that's where Yuki should have been. That's the performances of that team. But as you say, yeah, we would have grilled. Can you imagine Grid Talk last season? Well, this season, if it had been Sergio Perez pulling in these performances, Tom Horrocks would never have stopped going on about it. There'd be 17 naked podcasts at this point. But yeah, just it begs the question, like, what would have happened if Yuki had stayed in the Racing Bulls for this season, or vice as an alternative, had that pre-season to get used to the team before being thrown in after two races. But yeah, just not the end of his career so far that we would have liked to have seen from Yuki Tsunoda, I think. And there'll be some sad Japanese and Honda fans out there, at the very least, not seeing him like continue on. Like, I guess the question is, does he now end up at Aston Martin? Should they make a change in their driver lineup in the next few seasons? But yes.
Yeah, it's a mess in that team right now.
It truly is. And we look forward to seeing the chaos of 2026 now. Let's talk about the driver that Yuki Tsunoda replaced then, Red Bull. And, we're now moving into our D category of drivers. Liam Lawson, let's start off. I gave him a D, you gave him a D. Mid-season, he got a D. He didn't quite have the same highs as his teammate, but he did enough to convince Red Bull to keep him in the lineup for next season, at the very least, did Liam.
Yeah, I think it does need to be commended that Liam Lawson was able to keep going this season despite not only a horrific start with his new team, but then getting dropped after two races and being just in that. It must have been really difficult to try and bounce back. And he didn't have the best of bounce backs when he started back in Racing Bulls, but as the season went on, he did start to get some better finishes, started scoring some really good points, and got these performances which I think really saw his confidence get back. I think the reason why we're not going to give him as high as a score as Hadjar this season is because purely inconsistency. While Lawson did get good points, he didn't get them nearly as consistently, and he wasn't quite on the level that Hadjar was this season. He usually lost out. But I think it's very fair to give him a higher grade than Yuki. At the end of the day, he scored more championship points than Yuki did. And I think Lawson should walk away and be satisfied with the fact that he really did manage to pull his season round to the point where it looked like he could have been completely out of F1. But he's definitely there for next season, and let's see how he faces against another rookie teammate and see if he's going to be better than Lindblad, and if not, maybe we'd see the end of Liam Lawson. But yeah, I a D. It wasn't. I think had he stayed in Red Bull and continued to get points, he would be in the higher. But if you're getting dropped out of a team, you're never going to really get a C, are you?
No, I mean, like for a C, really, like you kind of have to have had a pretty average season, and I don't think, it was an average season for Liam Lawson. Dropping him after two races might have been a bit harsh, maybe get a bit further into the season, but Red Bull have the data to say Liam Lawson's performances are trending downwards. We'll swap him over, and then, his performances at the very least might stabilize in a more steady car. Yuki Tsunoda was clearly the more experienced driver, but Red Bull didn't make that decision at the start of the year. But, as you say, a very good point about Liam Lawson being able to bounce back. We saw Danny Kvyat get dropped and it crushed his season. We saw Pierre Gasly get dropped and it crushed his season. We saw Alex Albon, I believe, get dropped potentially at the end of the season. At that point, I think it was,
Yeah,
but
it
you
was
know,
the end.
Alex Albon just like in that like postseason looked like an absolute shell of himself at that point, and that's what the Red Bull second seat seems to do to drivers. But if you do at least bounce back, it gives you that opportunity, and we're seeing that in Alex Albon over in Williams, and who knows, we might see that in any of the other drivers. Should they make it out of that Red Bull stable further down the line. We'll
It's
move on
definitely a
to
healthier looking stable these days.
Absolutely. I mean, has we'll talk about Isaac Hadjar later. In fact, I won't do that now, but there is certainly something to be said for that stable. Let's move on to Esteban Ocon, our other D grade driver. We both gave him a C, and he had a mid-season grade of a C as well from Grid Talk. Have we potentially treated him too harshly? Good old Esteban Ocon.
Funny enough, I was actually having a think about this. Esteban Ocon was one of those drivers that I was one of the more difficult grades that I was at because I was like, what has Ocon done this season? And the answer is not much. And I don't think you can see that as a complete negative because Haas this season have kind of been this middling team who, which has had their kind of these peak moments at times, but for the most time have been quite invisible. Like Haas's like bad times haven't really been that bad, not especially in comparative to previous years where we've seen Haas kind of just meddle around the kind of rear of the grid. They have been very consistently in the midfield. They've been faster than the Alpines, usually faster than an Aston Martin, there or thereabouts with the Racing Bulls, more often than not faster than the Saubers, but just not as quick sometimes as the other Aston Martin or the other Racing Bull or the Williams. And they're not obviously they're not really touching this where the top four teams have been. So it leaves them in this weird spot where they are just getting on with their business, but they're not scoring big points and it's not flashy and showy. So I think a D is pretty fair because I think for a C, like I gave him a C because I thought he's done what he's needed to do this season, but I think a C would just need to be a little bit better than what he's done. Just the odd more points finish, especially in this latter half of the season. I think a lot more of his points as I'm looking through his season results. A lot of his points came in that sort of first half. So I think a bit of a better second half of the season, and we would have seen a lot more C's from our fellow Grid Talk members. But I think a D, even though I did give him a C, I think a D is also fair.
Yeah, and I think as well the thing that might makes me rationalize it as fair as well, having also given him a C, is that he's been outscored by his rookie teammate, granted only by 3 points, and there's really not a lot to split them. They both had 9 points finishes and one sprint in the top 10, but it's Ollie Behrman who's had the higher finish over the season, and it's Ollie Behrman's rookie season. Obviously, he had a couple of outings in the Haas and Ferraris last season, but Esteban Ocon is at this point, a seasoned veteran by all F1 standards, with how young some of these drivers start these days. You know, Esteban Ocon should be blowing Ollie Behrman out the water in terms of experience and racecraft. And, we did see a couple of things from Ollie Behrman that we'll probably talk about. But yeah, like, whilst there wasn't that random podium in a wet Brazil, like, generally, I think Esteban Ocon had a better season than he did last season, but at the same time, just needed, as you say, like that stronger performance over the whole of the season, as opposed to just start off strongly and taper out a bit more towards the end. But that's kind of how Haas had it as well. And, as you say, when you're in that grey area of not good enough to challenge those at the front, good enough to beat half of the teams and half of the drivers of those teams towards the back, you're always going to score some points consistently. I think it's, yeah, one of Haas's best seasons in a long time. Yeah. And we will round off the D grade drivers with F1's consistent D grade driver, Lance Stroll. We've both given him a D. His mid-season point was a D. It's the age-old question. What the heck is Lance Stroll still doing in Formula One? And has he done anything in his career to deserve still being in that seat, particularly going into a brand new set of regulations next year? What's Lance done in 2025, Louis?
He's failed to out-qualify Fernando Alonso ever. That's one thing he achieved in 2025. 0 for 24 was Lance Stroll in 2025. The only driver to have that record in qualifying, which is unsurprising given that we know Lance is a pretty terrible on a Saturday unless it's raining. But even then, that wasn't enough for him to get ahead of Fernando at any point during the season, or any point, in fact, of the last 36 races. I don't know if you know that, but Fernando Alonso is currently on a 36 Grand Prix run of out qualifying Lance Stroll. That is not good. But there was a lot of talk at the start of this season, and I remember it vividly as a Fernando Alonso fan, being told on this podcast and being told online that, oh, Lance has come good this year. He's really pushed the boat out. He's finally taken it to Fernando Alonso. And honestly, when you look at the points in the early part of the season, that was true. Fernando was coming so close, but yet so far in terms of scoring points. But yet again, Fernando Alonso has not only beaten Lance, but he has absolutely crushed him once again. Like Lance getting 33 points, Fernando 56 points, finishing much higher in the standings. A D is the best he's going to get until he actually beats convincingly one of his non-geriatric teammates, because that's who his last two have been. It was a retiring Sebastian Vettel and a Fernando Alonso, who, let's face it, should have retired a long time ago, yet still manages to beat him on a weekly basis. And we're going into 2026 with an Aston Martin who is possibly one of the biggest question marks in Formula One is what is this Aston Martin 2026? An Adrian Newey car with a Honda engine, it's a real like treat almost. Like, wow, what is this car going to be next season? With not to mention the massive amount of spice, which is completely new regulations. Yeah, I think next year is make or break for Lance. He's been in Formula One now for 10 years. 10 years. And I don't think we've ever given higher than a D grade.
I don't think we have
Ever.
either.
Yet this is someone who's been in Formula One for 10 years.
It's not good enough. It's really not good enough. And I think whilst he's still one of the drivers for Aston Martin, they can't take themselves seriously as like they haven't put in a performance to be considered championship contenders. But at the same time, whilst Lance Stroll is still there, their ambitions for being a championship contender is laughable. Like, we criticize Red Bull for having that second seat, but they at least have Max Verstappen who is capable of putting in a championship winning performance. I can't see Aston Martin doing so at the moment unless, Adrian Newey, god tier like designer for next season, like puts Aston Martin like with a sort of Braun GP-esque like performance. I just can't see it. I can't see Lance Stroll being in a team that wins a championship because you need both your drivers really, as far as I can tell. Perez, let Red Bull down last season a little bit, but you could also argue Red Bull let Perez down. Aston Martin with Lance Stroll is not a combination that wins a championship. It's certainly not a five-star performance, and nor was this seg. Because if you think Grid Talk is a five-star podcast, we'd love it if you could take 5 to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Music or Spotify. And if you're not subscribed on the platform you're currently listening to, and you're still sticking around, please do consider giving us a subscribe and all that other fun engagement analytics stuff. And let's move on to the C's. And we're going to talk about Sauber. We're going to talk about Gabby Bortoleto first of all. I gave him a D. You've given him a C. Mid-season was a C. Coming in as a rookie in what was expected to be the worst car on the grid. You know, Sauber put in some pretty good performances throughout the year. But for Gabby, it was always going to be a season of learning, I think, with his much more experienced teammate, giving him pointers and showing him basically how to, be a better driver. It's his debut season, but is it all eyes on 2026 now for Gabby?
I think so. I think I think he was coming into he's in one of those lucky situations that I think you find yourself in Formula One when you are debuting in a car that you are not expected to shine in. It's a blessing and a curse because it's a curse in the sense that you're not going to have those big point finishes and that championship kind of finish where you'd be like, whoa, look at me, look at what I did. But then it's a blessing in the sense of, well, nobody was really expecting you to do that. You're going to be compared against your teammate, and that's pretty much it. And while he hasn't beaten Hulkenberg over the course of the season, he has certainly done a very good job. And I think he has done much better than what I think a lot of people would have expected him to do. Because he is an incredibly talented driver. Like, I don't think people were expecting much of him, and I think that was slightly unfair given the other rookies that were coming in. I think he may have gone under the radar a little bit with the likes of Behrman, who he'd already kind of showed his face in Formula One. Lawson is the same. Hadjar was I think another one maybe on the same as Bortoleto was kind of, and then obviously Kimi coming into Formula One was the big news. And so when he sort of went on that really good run in the middle of the season, I think it definitely took a lot of people by surprise and started making people notice him. I think he went like three Grand Prix back to back, getting into Q3, got a really good sort of points finishes in that sort of later European season. And, he's got the odd point here and there, and he's done pretty much everything he's just needed to do. Sauber is not a quick car, and it was never designed to really be a particularly quick car. But I think this year he's done a lot of learning, he's done a lot of improving. And while it hasn't been as flashy as some other drivers that we'll mention later in the rookie season, I think a C is a very solid thing. I think we have been blessed this year with a year of rookies that haven't done particularly badly, which is very rare for Formula One.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about previous rookies who've come in and had cars not expected to perform in, there's obviously the highs of Mick Schumacher and Nikita Mazepin, Formula One greats who will have a legacy that stretches forever. I think Gabby Bortoleto and the rookies that we've had that came into the season this season, have all had a good chance to shine. I think there was a period where Gabby Bortoleto was out qualifying Nico Hulkenberg quite consistently this season, and Nico Hulkenberg is a driver who's known for having that one lap pace. And this season, Gabby Bortoleto, whilst being a rookie, has had a good standing in terms of finish putting in better quality performances. And there was a period, and we'll might as well talk about Nico Hulkenberg now because he's also got a C from Grid Talk as well. He got that podium and it seemed to check out at that point. It was the P3 in Silverstone and then doesn't finish in the points again until Kota, which is quite mad really when you think about it. Because as we say, that Sauber in the mid-season had quite a bit of performance. But it was Bortoleto that was able to extract the best of it. But there were some unlucky incidents for Nico Hulkenberg, obviously getting the blame for that incident in, I believe, the Kota sprint, even though Zak Brown probably needed to check the footage before he made some comments. But, I think it was more the unfortunate thing for Nico Hulkenberg is that Sauber just lost a bit of momentum, at that point in the season.
Yeah, they did have this really great run. As I said, like Gabby was picking up these great points in that kind of latter European time. But in that time just before that, it kind of we saw this real peak from Nico Hulkenberg starting to score these great points in Spain, Canada, in Austria, and in Silverstone, obviously culminating in that that podium, which is still an amazing moment of the season, one of the best moments of the season. But then his performances dipped, and then we started seeing Gabby kind of riding the end of that wave and starting to score points. But yeah, it wasn't the most inspiring season from Sauber, and I think we're looking at Hulkenberg as someone who has He took a few years out, he's come back in, and he's really hit the ground running. And we know that he's a great driver, and he's continued to do what we all expect him to do. And I think a C is very fair. He finished 11th in the championship this season in a car that was more like the eighth or ninth quickest. And that is very, very respectable. I think the reason why he hasn't got a B is because he hasn't got as consistent point scoring, and he wasn't as consistently ahead of Bortoleto throughout the entire season, which has kind of knocked his grade down, especially in my eyes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a bit like what I was saying about like Esteban Ocon versus his rookie teammate. Like there was just that, like Nico Hülkenberg has done a stellar job this season, but it just wasn't quite consistent enough across the entire of the season to justify the higher grade. But you could see a justification for it if, you squint a little bit and things like that. And, a respectable, I think, drive from the Sauber drivers, while Sauber have still ended up finishing in P9 in the constructors, which, there's a point where we're like, are they going to get P6? Are they maybe even going to get P5 if Williams's, poor performances continue? But, decent from Sauber. And I can't believe I've managed to say that given the previous couple of seasons' performances. And speaking of decent compared to the constructors at the very least, let's talk about Pierre Gasly, who is cursed to be driving an Alpine at this current stage of his career. And I think he was always gonna struggle, We've given him a C as Grid Talk, you gave him a C, I gave him a D, but I think it's just kind of it I blame Alpine. I think, that's where the responsibility for Pierre Gasly's performance this season truly lies because they haven't given him a car that he can compete in. He's struggled to score points finishes, and this is not really where we should be seeing Pierre Gasly, I don't think.
Yeah, my score of Pierre Gasly was mostly to do with the fact that he has been dragging that dead horse of a Haas throughout the season and actually
You mean
managing to
Alpine?
score Alpine. No, dragging the dead horse of the Alpine. It's late here. And he's been doing it in the most Pierre Gasly way of just outdriving the car, being better than his teammate, doing anything he can. But honestly, you do look at his results this year and they do make for sorry sites. You see these P18s and these P19s, and you know that the person behind him was probably just his teammates. And it just shows how poor this Alpine has been. It has been shockingly bad. Once again, this is a team that has had so much drama going on behind the scenes in terms of management, in terms of team personnel and drivers and contracts, and just it has been a mess. And this is what happens when you cannot operate a Formula One team correctly. You see a team that was pretty solid, finishing fourth, fifth in the Constructors' Championships, building year on year, looking like a real contender, and now they are stone dead at the bottom with a donkey of a car, with a team that is a mess, who is owned, by the way, by like a million people. By the way, like Alpine is doesn't have is sold off so much of its team to so many random people. It doesn't look great, and not to mention that they completely dead in their engine. How they're actually becoming a customer team instead of a manufacturer, which just goes to show the complete and utter downfall. This is a team that used to supply engines to Red Bull, and now they don't even manufacture their own engines. I don't know, say more.
When they just didn't get 2014 right, it triggered that death spiral for Renault, and now Alpine are going to be Alpine Mercedes next season, and it's just like, I don't think that's going to save them. I don't think it's going to save them. And as you say, is there anything else we can say at this point? Funny, cut to this time next year when we're recording the driver grades and Pierre Gasly's just won the world championship or something like that. But, it might be a parallel universe where that happens, but Yeah, no, it's just been painful to watch Alpine this season. And until you just mentioned the mess of management, I forgot that they even started this season with Oliver Oakes and stuff like that running the team. And now they're finished off with, alleged criminal Briatore. It's just madness what's gone on there. Sacre bleu, sacre bleu. Yeah. Let's stop talking about Alpine. I don't want to talk about Alpine. Nobody wants to talk about Alpine. Let's move on to Ollie Behrman, a rookie driver this season who, has been given a lot of praise, I think, as well, and at the mid-season point, we gave him a C. We're obviously finishing off this season giving him a C. It's not a bad result, I don't think, for Oliver Behrman, He made some silly mistakes, was punished by the FIA and stewards for what a lot of people would consider racing, but he's shown a lot of signs this season, I think, of the driver that everyone is expecting him to become, and potentially even should Ferrari come a knocking because a seven-time world champion gets fed up, you know, maybe we'll see him in that Scarlet team later on. But, I think a C is a fairly decent standard for Ollie Behrman and, has outperformed his teammate. And yeah, what do you think?
No, I think, as I said earlier, I have been really pleased with the standard of the rookies that we've had come in. We had so many rookies come in, and Bar Franco, obviously, and do bar the Alpine. Like I said, we've already mentioned Alpine. Forget about Alpine. Think of every other driver that's come into Formula One this season. The crop has been really good, and I can't think of any time since maybe 2019 when we had Lando, Russell, and Albon all come into the sport at the same time. Have we had a crop of rookies that have been really good? And I think Behrman had a solid first half of the season, was just missing out on points. He has that horrible string of 11th places, which is like the Esteban Gutierrez syndrome of just like missing out on the points every single time. But if you look at this sort of backstretch of Grand Prix going all the way back from the summer until now, his points, his consistency has been excellent. He's really showing what a potential Ferrari driver he could be in the future. And I think he has done a brilliant job this year. It's not been standout, it's not been stellar, but it has been solid. And I think a C is the worthy grade of that.
Exactly. The debut season I think you need as a rookie joining a team like Haas. Solid is a good summary of Ollie Behrman's 2025. And let's finish off part one of our driver grades talking about the seven-time world champion himself, Lewis Hamilton. The both of us have given him C's. It's an improvement on the mid-season driver grade of a D. That is despite the fact that all of Lewis Hamilton's better results came before the mid-season driver grades. If you consider, sprint win in China before getting DSQ'd from the race, a subsequent P3 in the Miami sprint. If you judge Lewis Hamilton's season off the sprints, it's not that bad, but unfortunately there's only 6 sprints and 24 other opportunities for Ferrari to Ferrari. And it's just never gelled as much as his teammate did. And if you take these results in isolation, put him in a Haas or something like that, this is a stellar season from Lewis Hamilton. But this is not the drive that you expected going into the season that was hyped up, having had Ferrari finish P2 in the Constructors in 2024. Oh, it's going to be the eighth title for Lewis Hamilton. And lo and behold, he limps across the line 6 points ahead of Kimi Antonelli in the drivers' standings. It's just been painful, I think, for Lewis. And 2025, I think, was never really going to be the year, but don't sell us on the idea that it might be.
I think people sold themselves on what it might be. Like everyone saw this Ferrari move as like the greatest thing on earth, and then people came to quickly remind themselves why for Charles Leclerc is yet to win a world championship. I think because let's face it, Charles Leclerc is more than willing to and more than capable of winning a world championship. It's just that the team he drives for doesn't. And I don't know what you can say. It's like I'm looking at him like, yeah, I did give Lewis a C. I did. And then I'm looking at what other people have given, and I'm seeing Tom Horrocks gave him an E and Jawad gave him a D, and I'm like, yeah, you know what, they might have something there. It has been a pretty underwhelming season from Lewis Hamilton, and I just think he has not come to terms with this. Like as you said, I don't think he's come to terms with this team at all. It's such a differently run team. You go from a seven-time championship winning team who's just won it on the bounce, best staff, best organization, some of the best strategy, a team that was completely unbeatable, to then Ferrari, who you see Lewis just getting so agitated, so frustrated with his race engineer, forever fed up with what tires he's on, how bad the strategy is, what he wants to do, and how the team is just like, we are checking it. It's just, it is poor. And I think it is just been a disaster. And a C, I think it's actually quite kind. I think I'm somewhat regretting my thing of my score of a C. His sprint win definitely does boost his rating a little bit. And to be honest, it's while he's qualifying of late in the back end of the season has been pretty poor. He did have quite a decent performance in Abu Dhabi given his qualifying. Same with some of the other races where he didn't qualify so well. I think his ability to score points is definitely unquestioned. He's very rarely scored outside of the points. So I don't think it's the worst season we've seen from Lewis Hamilton. Actually, that's probably not true, but
I think
it's
statistically
definitely.
it is, but
I
in
think it
terms,
is one. Yeah, but if in terms of the cut, I mean, 2009 was also pretty poor, but he did win a race that season. So yeah, not great, but not awful.
yeah,
See,
I think the epitome of it was really kind of like Singapore, where he was putting in some blistering lap times for like half of the race, and then that Ferrari just fell apart because it couldn't keep up with Lewis Hamilton trying to at least make a performance out of it. Because Ferrari just had to lift and coast constantly throughout the season. It was like they designed a car around something that wasn't gonna work, and obviously, I think China probably caught them out because they did get disqualified for, I think Lewis Hamilton was being underweight. Charles Leclerc, I think, might have had plank wear. Like Ferrari had to lift their ride height so consistently that the car just didn't perform how any of the drivers wanted it to. But then, as we'll get to in part two, Leclerc managed to get quite a decent run of performances, and we'll get to that next time. But Louis, whilst we've still got you, anything you want to plug at this point?
the only thing I'd like to plug is our Grid Talk socials. So we did run a Grid Talk predictions challenge throughout the whole season. We have crowned our champion. And if you want to find out who the Grid Talk prediction champions are, you will have to go to our socials. But we hopefully will be producing some good stuff during the off season too. So please make sure to keep an eye out to see when that will be coming your way.
Yeah, the season might have finished, but we haven't, certainly not. If you want to hear anything more from me, I'm at Ruby Rose Price on Instagram, and Grid Talk is available on YouTube as well as Amazon Fire, Spotify, Apple Music, Verbal, and Pocket Casts. Just search Formula One Grid Talk for our back catalogue of shows with previews and reactions to the race results. Thank you to Jared Bradley and Holly Eagle for supporting us on Patreon. If you want to support the show further, why not sign up to our Patreon for exclusive content? And also make sure you subscribe to the first know when each new weekly episode is released. We'll be back soon with plenty more F1 content, including part 2 of our driver grades. Thank you very much for listening to the Grid Talk podcast presented by Green Wheels, and goodbye.